The village measured worth in two currencies, the visible and the invisible. The visible currency was coin, wool, grain stacked in barns, the number of healthy children, the straightness of a fence. It was counted, traded, and taxed. The invisible currency was noise, the volume of one's complaint at council, the sharpness of gossip, the performative sigh of burden. This second currency bought social credit, a buffer against misfortune. To be poor in the first was a hardship. To be poor in both was to be erased. This was the unspoken arithmetic of survival, the cold equation that governed every hearth and field. The system did not need guards at the gate. It had something far more efficient, the collective gaze of neighbors who had internalized its rules. They policed not with swords, but with turned backs and dismissive laughter, enforcing conformity through the simple, devastating weapon of being noticed only when useful, or better yet, not being noticed at all. This was the societal machinery into which the man they called the fool was born, not cast out, but meticulously placed in a role designed by the system itself. His cruelty was not a dramatic exile into snow, it was the quiet, perpetual exile within the walls. The door was never slammed, it was simply never opened, and he was expected to be grateful for the draught that came through the crack beneath it. The injustice was not a single act of malice, but the ambient condition of his life, the assumption that because he spoke little, he thought less. And because he thought less, he was worth less. The village had written his value on a ledger long ago, in the column reserved for surplus and mistake, and they consulted this ledger every time they saw him, confirming their own judgment. They did not understand that he was reading a different ledger entirely, one that tracked not the clamor of the market square, but the silent flow of obligation, debt, and the brittle pride of those who believed themselves clever. His name was forgotten, or perhaps it was never truly known. The village called him the fool, and the name stuck like burrs to wool, a label that required no thought. He lived in the smallest cottage at the edge of the common, where the good land gave way to stubborn clay and stone. The air there always carried the damp, mineral smell of the earth, a scent of cold foundations. In the mornings you could hear the rhythmic scrape of his whetstone on iron, a sound as regular as a heartbeat, ignored as completely. His hands were his most articulate feature, broad and scarred, the knuckles swollen from decades of work that asked for strength over delicacy. The skin was cross-hatched with pale lines, a map of old cuts from splintered wood and sharpened tools. He was a mender. He fixed what others broke or discarded, a trade that dealt exclusively in aftermaths. His workshop was a landscape of quiet salvage, a broken cartwheel leaning against the wall, a pile of hinges waiting for new pins, a kettle with a hole the size of a pea. The smell was of old grease, hot metal, and the clean, dry scent of seasoned wood. He moved through this space with an economy that seemed like slowness to the hurried eye, but was in fact pure efficiency, no motion wasted, no tool misplaced. He spoke only when a question was direct and required an answer, and even then his words were few, factual, and devoid of the ornamentation of complaint or boast. This silence was his primary characteristic, and the village interpreted it through their own lens. To the blacksmith it was stupidity, to the weaver's wife it was a lack of wit. To the children it was a vacancy to be filled with taunts, though he never reacted, his eyes simply passing over them as if they were part of the weather. They did not see the observation, they saw an empty vessel. His daily walk to the well was a study in this dynamic. He moved along the edge of the path, his boots making a soft, consistent crunch on the gravel. Conversations would dip as he passed, not out of respect, but from the mild social discomfort of an object moving through a human space. Then resume with a slightly louder tone, as if to reclaim the air he had briefly occupied. He would nod if a glance was met, a small, neutral dip of the chin that acknowledged presence without demanding connection. He paid for his few supplies with exact coin, counted out slowly on the worn wood of the merchant's counter, and received his goods with the same silent care. The merchant would sigh afterward, a performance for the next customer, about the trial of doing business with a simpleton. This was the personal cost lived every hour. It was not the dramatic hunger of an empty belly, though his meals were simple. It was the hunger for recognition as a thinking being, a hunger he had long since stopped feeding, letting it atrophy into a kind of strength. His ally in this was not a person, but the nature of his work itself. Mending requires one to understand how things are meant to fit, to see the original design in the fractured pieces. It teaches patience, for glue must set and metal must cool. It teaches value, for often the worth of the whole far exceeds the cost of the repair. And most importantly, it teaches you about breakpoints, the specific place where stress accumulates and failure begins. While the village saw a man fixing a stool, he was conducting a silent seminar on structural integrity. His kindness was practical, unheralded. He would return a mended toy to a child without seeking the parents, leaving it on their step. He would shore up a neighbor's sagging fence on a winter afternoon when no one was about. No thanks were expected, and none were given. These acts were not investments in social capital. They were the simple maintenance of his world, and in performing them unseen, he remained perfectly invisible, a ghost of competence in a village that prized only the noise of ambition. The decree arrived with the spring rains, carried by a rider whose cloak was the deep, wet green of the royal forest. He did not dismount. He read the words from a wax, sealed parchment, his voice cutting through the drizzle and the chatter of the market square. It was a new tax, the king's infrastructure levy. Every household, every productive entity within the realm was to contribute. The mechanism was simple, elegant in its bureaucratic cruelty. The tax was not a flat fee, it was a percentage. 15% of the assessed productive value of the preceding year. The rider explained the assessment method. For farmers, it was 15% of their recorded harvest yield, converted to its market value at the time of the last autumn fair. For herdsmen, 15% of the value of their flocks, counted at the spring shearing. For craftsmen, 15% of the gross income from their trade, as best estimated by the guild masters. The numbers were precise. The percentages were fixed. The rider listed the penalties for non-compliance, a fine of 50% of the owed tax for late payment, seizure of property equal to the owed amount for refusal. The words hung in the damp air, 15%, 50%, the system had spoken. It was a pure expression of systemic logic, divorced from the mud and struggle of the village. It saw only inputs and outputs, assets and yields. It did not see a bad harvest, a sick cow, a broken loom. It saw columns in a ledger. The rider finished his recitation. He nailed a copy of the decree to the door of the meeting hall. The sound of the hammer was sharp, final. Then he turned his horse and rode back the way he came, leaving behind a silence deeper than before. Then the noise erupted. Calculations began. Voices overlapped, frantic. The miller shouted numbers, the weaver cursed. The farmer stared at his hands as if they had betrayed him. The tax was a vortex. It would pull wealth from the village, from every home and workshop, and funnel it along the road to the king's treasury. Its purpose was stated as infrastructure, roads and bridges, but its effect was immediate financial compression. It would take food from plates, wool from backs, coin from pouches. It was legal, it was documented, it was enforced by the crown's authority. To resist was to become an outlaw, to pay was to become poorer. This was the conflict, not with a monster, but with a line of text on parchment. The system had flexed, and the village felt the squeeze. In his workshop, the fool had stopped his work to listen. He stood in the doorway, the smell of rain on clay thick around him. He heard the numbers. 15%, 50%. His face showed no alarm, no anger. His eyes were distant, focused on an internal calculation. He was not thinking of his own meager stores. He was examining the mechanism itself, the percentage, the assessment, the penalty. He saw the gears of it, how they were meant to mesh. He also saw the tiny gaps between them, the tolerances built into the design by arrogant engineers who never imagined someone would measure them. He turned back to his bench. Before him lay a broken clock, its springs spilled like metallic entrails. He picked up a tiny gear, holding it to the grey light from the window. He understood pressure points. He understood how a small, precise force applied to the right place could stop a large machine. The king had just shown him where to apply it. The village moved through the following days like a body in shock. The fool moved through them with the same deliberate pace as always, but his eyes were different. They were no longer simply observing the physical world of carts and fences. They were tracing the invisible lines of stress that now ran through every conversation, every transaction. He watched the blacksmith at his forge, the hammer blows coming faster, angrier, as if beating the tacks out of the iron. He heard the weaver arguing with her husband about which bolts of cloth to sell first. He saw the farmer standing in his field, not sowing, but calculating the space each seed would take, the yield it might give, and the 15% that would be taken from it before it ever reached his children's mouths. The fool's own assessment was conducted by the guild master of menders, a portly man who rarely left his comfortable shop in the town. The man arrived with a wax tablet and a look of profound inconvenience. He walked through the fool's workshop, his nose wrinkling at the smell of grease and old wood. He poked at a half-mended chair. He glanced at the tools. He asked no questions about technique or skill. He simply estimated. He looked at the fool's rough tunic, his simple boots, the modest hearth. He made a notation. He declared the annual productive value of the mending trade, as practiced here, to be 20 silver coins. Therefore, the tax owed was 3 silver coins. The fool listened. He nodded once. He did not protest the low valuation. He did not point to the cartwheel he had saved from being firewood, or the dozen hinges that would let doors swing true again. The valuation was an insult, but it was also a data point. It told him exactly how the system saw him, not as a craftsman, but as a negligible entry in a column. The guildmaster left, already thinking of his next call. The fool went to his locked chest, a heavy thing of scarred oak. He opened it. Inside were his savings, the physical result of a lifetime of quiet work. There were coins, but not many. There were other things, a small ingot of good tin, several lengths of fine brass wire, a handful of carefully selected river stones that held an edge. These were his real wealth, materials acquired through trade and salvage, their value known only to him. He counted out 3 silver coins from his meager hoard. Then he paused. He looked at the coins in his palm. He looked at the decree, a copy of which now sat on his bench, the numbers clear, 15% of assessed value. He put 1 silver coin back in the chest. He took out a different coin, older, worn almost smooth. He took out a second coin of similar ilk. He took out a third, a copper piece that was more green than brown. He laid these 3 coins beside the 2 good silvers. He studied them. The tax was to be paid in legal tender. The decree did not specify the quality of the coin, only that it be coin of the realm. These 5 coins were all coin of the realm. Their collective face value was 3 silver coins. Their actual metallic value, their worth to a moneylender or a smelter, was perhaps half that, but the system did not assess metallic value. It assessed face value. It was a rule. He had found the first gap. the tolerance between the gear of assessment and the gear of payment. He did not smile, he felt no triumph. He felt the cool clarity of a problem understood. He wrapped the 5 coins in a scrap of soft leather. He placed the packet on the corner of his bench, ready for the collector. Then he returned to the broken clock. His fingers, steady and sure, began to sort the tiny springs. He was mending, but he was also preparing. The first move in an invisible war had been calculated. It was not a move of defiance. It was a move of perfect, literal compliance. And it would cost the king more than 3 silver coins to understand it. The tax collector arrived on the appointed day, a thin man with ink-stained fingers and a ledger bound in dark leather. He set up his table in the market square. One by one, the villagers came forward. They came with pouches of coin, with small sacks of grain measured to the exact weight, with promises and pleas. The collector did not look at their faces. He looked at his ledger, he checked names, he weighed grain on a brass scale that clicked with finality. He counted coins with a speed that spoke of long practice. He made notations. A line through a name meant paid, a red mark meant a shortfall. The air grew thick with the smell of dust and anxiety. The miller paid, but his payment was in coarse flour, not coin, and the collector spent 10 minutes calculating the conversion rate, docking value for quality. The weaver paid, but she was short by a few coppers, and the 50% penalty was immediately assessed, written in red beside her name. Her protest was a sharp cry that cut through the murmur, then died. The penalty stood. The system was proving it had teeth. The blacksmith paid in full, his coins ringing sharply on the table, his face like forged iron. He walked away without a word. The farmer came last, his payment a mix of coin and the last of his seed barley. The collector accepted it, his expression bored. The village ledger now showed a pattern of compliance punctuated by red marks, the visible proof of the system's enforcement. The social fabric, already strained, now showed new tears. The weaver would not speak to the miller, blaming him for setting a bad precedent with his flour. The farmer avoided everyone, shame and calculation warring in his eyes. The power structure had been reinforced not by soldiers, but by numbers in a book. The villagers had seen the consequence of resistance, however small. The 50% penalty was not just a financial loss. It was a public brand, a mark of failure that would be remembered. They had learned the cost of standing at the wrong angle to the machine. They would be more careful next time. They would work harder, sell more, hide less. The system had achieved its primary goal, behavioral modification, through predictable punishment. It had turned their energy inward, against themselves and each other, in a competition to avoid the red mark. As the collector packed his ledger, his assistant approached. He was a young man with a curious mind. He held out a small leather packet, the fool's payment. The collector opened it. He poured the 5 coins into his palm. 2 silver, 1 worn silver, 1 copper. He frowned. He counted the face value. 3 silver. The tax was paid, but the quality was poor. The worn coin was barely legal. The copper was acceptable, but of low denomination. He looked at his ledger. The fool's entry, assessed value 20 silver, tax owed 3 silver, payment received 3 silver in face value. There was no rule about coin quality, only that it be coin of the realm. There was no red mark to make. The collector hesitated. The payment was technically correct. It was also an insult, a deliberate presentation of minimal value. It mocked the assessment. But to reject it would require creating a new rule on the spot, which he did not have the authority to do. To accept it felt like a defeat. He looked across the square toward the fool's cottage. The man was not there watching. He was presumably inside, mending something. The collector felt a flicker of something unfamiliar, a suspicion that he had been out-maneuvered by the simplest of moves. He shrugged. He dropped the coins into his strongbox. They made a dull, disappointing sound. He made a neat line through the fool's name, paid in full. He did not understand that he had just recorded the first successful probe against the system's logic, a probe that cost nothing but revealed everything. The village's collective failure had cemented the king's power. The fool's quiet, perfect compliance had just planted the seed of its undoing. In the days that followed, the village was a storm of activity and worry, but the fool's workshop was an island of calm. The air inside was still and carried the scent of pine resin, beeswax, and the faint, metallic tang of oiled steel. He was working on a large, old chest, its wood darkened by time and neglect. His hands moved over the surface, the pads of his fingers reading the grain like a language. He felt the rough patches where the finish had worn away, the smooth hollows where hands had gripped it for generations. He did not rush. He mixed a paste of beeswax and turpentine, warming it in a small pot over a low flame until the smell filled the room, sweet and sharp. He applied it with a soft cloth, working in small, circular motions, the friction warming the wood, allowing the wax to seep into the pores. The process was slow, hypnotic. It required no thought, only presence. His mind was free to wander the paths of the problem he had been set, the tax, the percentage, the assessment. He thought not in terms of rebellion, but in terms of material properties. If a system is a structure like this chest, then a tax is a load applied to it. The village was a structure. The king's decree had placed a load upon it. The villagers were reacting by trying to strengthen their own little beams, working harder, but the load remained and the structure groaned. His approach was different. He was looking for the load-bearing joint that was hidden, the one the designer had forgotten. The payment of the worn coins had been a test, like tapping a wall to hear if it was hollow. The collector's acceptance had confirmed it. The system had a weakness. It could only process what it was programmed to see. It saw face value, not real value. It saw categories, not exceptions. It was a blunt instrument. A mender's work, by contrast, was all about exceptions. Every broken thing was unique. A chair leg did not splinter the same way twice. A hinge wore out in its own particular pattern. You could not apply a standard fix. You had to observe, diagnose, and then apply a solution that fit the specific damage. This was his skill, the quiet virtue. It was not magic, it was attention. It was the willingness to sit with a broken thing until it revealed its secret. He finished waxing the chest. The wood now had a deep, soft glow. The scratches softened into part of its history. He ran his hand over the lid. It was smooth, solid. It would last another lifetime. He cleaned his tools, wiping each one with an oily rag before placing it back in its designated spot on the wall. The order of the workshop was a bulwark against the chaos outside. Here, everything had a place, a purpose, and a known state of repair. He stepped outside as the evening drew in. The air was cool, carrying the distant smell of wood smoke from hearths where families were counting their remaining stores. He could hear the faint, anxious murmur of conversation from the nearest house. He stood for a long moment, looking not at the village, but at the road that led to the king's city. It was a grey ribbon in the twilight. He thought of the coins traveling that road, sitting in a strongbox, their diminished value a tiny, invisible leak in the royal treasury. A leak that followed the rules. He went back inside. He banked the fire. The light in the workshop faded to a soft orange glow on the tools. In the darkness, the lesson was clear. When you cannot break the system, you study it. You find its tolerances. And then you apply pressure, quietly, legally, until it fails under its own weight. The village saw a fool wasting time on an old chest. They did not see a strategist preparing his materials. The collector's report reached the king's treasurer, a man whose world was made of numbers and precedents. He reviewed the ledger from the village. The sums were adequate. The red marks showed the system was working, applying pressure where needed. Then his eye fell on the entry for the mender. Paid in full, the notation was clean. But the assistant had appended a verbal note, a rare breach of protocol driven by unease. It read, payment technically correct but of minimal quality, 2 good silver, 1 worn, 1 copper, face value met. The treasurer stared at the words. Minimal quality, face value met, a contradiction. The system was designed to process value, but it only recognized one kind, the kind stamped on a coin. It had no censor for wear, for deceit, for the quiet insult of legal compliance. The treasurer felt a familiar irritation, the kind provoked by a speck of dust in a well-oiled machine. He considered the options. He could issue a clarification, decreeing that future taxes must be paid in coin of a certain weight and fineness. But that would require an assay, new officials, more complexity. It would also be a reaction to a single, insignificant entry from a village fool. It would look like weakness, an admission that the system could be gamed by poor coins. The smarter move, the arrogant move, was to ignore it, to treat it as an anomaly, a glitch caused by the stupidity of the payer, not a flaw in the design. The king's system was robust. It could absorb a few bad coins. The treasurer made his decision. He would not amend the rules. He would not even mention it in his report to the king. To do so would be to give weight to the actions of a nobody. He closed the ledger. The incident was filed away, a tiny, unresolved tension in the bureaucracy, but the seed was now in 2 places. It was in the fool's mind, where it was growing into a plan, and it was in the treasury, where it lay dormant as a dismissed anomaly. The system, confident in its own bulk, had failed its first diagnostic test. It had shown that it could not perceive a threat that did not look like a threat, that spoke the language of obedience rather than rebellion. The fool, upon hearing nothing, no new decree, no visit from a reeve, understood the message perfectly. His probe had been noted and discarded. The tolerance was wider than he had hoped. The gap between the gears was not a crack, it was a chasm. He could move within it. He returned to his work, but now his projects changed. He began to collect things others threw away, bent nails which he straightened with careful blows. Fragments of good leather, short ends of usable rope. He sorted them not by what they were, but by what they could be. He was assembling a toolkit, not of rebellion but of hyper-compliance. If the system wanted 15% of assessed value, he would give it exactly that, in the most literal, minimally valuable form the rules allowed. He would become a perfect citizen of the kingdom's logic, and in doing so, he would demonstrate that the logic was bankrupt. The conflict was now fully engaged. The king saw a subject, the fool saw a system, and the system, blinded by its own assumptions, did not see the fool at all. The story of the fool's payment did not remain in the ledger. It leaked out through the assistant, who mentioned it to the blacksmith's apprentice over a mug of ale. From there, it traveled through the village like a slow, creeping vine. At first, it was just a curious fact. The fool paid with bad coins. Then it became a joke. Did you hear? He paid his tax with a copper and 2 buttons. Laughter in the tavern, sharp and dismissive. Then the interpretation set in. The weaver, smarting from her penalty, said it proved he was too simple to understand real money. The miller, always calculating, said it was just cheapness, the act of a miser. The farmer said nothing, but thought it was foolishness that would bring more trouble. The social mechanism of gossip did its work. It transformed an act of precise, systemic probing into a character flaw. It reinforced the existing narrative. He was the fool. This was just more foolishness. The village, in its need to make sense of the world, filed the event away in the category of things that confirmed their prejudices. They did not see the calculation. They saw only the surface, the poor coins, and they judged him by it. This social perception became a secondary trap, one that worked to the fool's advantage. Because they dismissed him, they stopped watching him. His invisibility deepened. He could move through the village now like a ghost, his actions beneath notice. When he spent an afternoon carefully straightening a bucket of bent nails, they saw a man wasting time. They did not see him building a reserve of legally defined productive materials with almost zero market cost. When he traded a well-mended stool for a sack of barley ends, the sweepings from the miller's floor, they saw a bad bargain. They did not see him acquiring tack, sable grain at a rate far below assessed value. The village contempt was his camouflage. Their laughter was the sound of his security. They were so busy policing each other, enforcing the social conformity that the tax had heightened, that they had no energy to spare for the quiet man at the edge. The societal layer here was not just the tax, but the village's own complicity in maintaining the hierarchy. By labeling and dismissing the fool, they were performing a service for the king's system. They were identifying the nonconformist, isolating him and rendering him harmless through mockery. They did not realize they were isolating the one person who had found a way to fight back. The king's arrogance was mirrored in the village zone. Both assumed that intelligence must announce itself, that competence must be noisy. Both were wrong. And in their shared error, they gave the fool the one thing he needed most: time and space to work unnoticed. The treasurer's monthly report to the king was a dry recitation of numbers: revenue collected, percentages met, shortfalls noted. The king listened, his fingers drumming on the arm of his throne. He was a man who believed in systems, in the clean application of force through law and number. The red marks in the ledger pleased him. They showed the system was biting. Then the treasurer, almost as an afterthought, mentioned the curious case from the village. A mender, assessed at 20 silver, paid with a mix of good and bad coin, face value correct. He presented it as a minor administrative curiosity, a testament to the simplicity of some subjects. The king's drumming fingers stopped. A mender, bad coin, face value correct. He did not hear an anomaly, he heard opportunity. His mind, trained to see resources and extraction, performed a swift calculation. If the man was so ignorant of coin that he would overpay by using bad currency, then he was likely ignorant in other ways. He was probably sitting on unrealized value, skill that could be harnessed, materials that could be requisitioned. The village called him a fool. The king saw a potential asset, one so simple he could be bound by the letter of a contract and made to work for far less than he was worth. The arrogance was breathtaking. The king assumed the error was the fool's. He never considered that the error might be in the system's design or in his own perception. He ordered the treasurer to have the local reeve draw up a contract. The fool was to be conscripted into royal service for a period of 1 year. His duty, the maintenance and repair of all crown property within a day's ride of the village. This included tools, carts, furniture, and minor structures. In return, he would be paid a wage of 15 silver coins for the year and be exempt from the infrastructure levy. The contract was to be presented as an honor, a royal commission. The king leaned back, satisfied. He had turned a potential leak into a source of cheap labor. He had closed the loophole by capturing the looper. He did not see the trap. He was building it himself. The contract was the mechanism. It was a system within the system, a set of rules that would now govern the fool's actions. The king believed he was imposing his will. In reality, he was handing the fool a blueprint, a legally binding document that specified exactly what was required and, more importantly, what was not forbidden. The fool's trade was mending. The king had just officially recognized it and demanded its application on a grand scale. The twist was set. The fool would not fight the king. He would work for him. He would mend for him with exacting, literal, devastating competence. The conflict had escalated from a skirmish over tax payment to a formal engagement. The king had entered the arena of the fool's expertise, believing he held all the power. He did not understand that in a contest of meticulous, rule-bound labor, the power belongs to the one who understands the rules and the materials, down to the last bent nail. The contract arrived, delivered by the reeve with a perfunctory air. The fool took the parchment. He did not read it aloud. He read it slowly, his eyes tracing each word, each clause. He was not looking for the spirit of the agreement. He was looking for the letter. The specific definitions, the obligations, the boundaries, the psychology at work here was not one of anger or rebellion, but of deep, patient analysis. He had spent a lifetime learning to fix broken things by understanding their original, intended function. A contract was no different. It was a mechanism designed to produce a certain outcome, the transfer of labor from him to the crown. His task was to understand every component of that mechanism. The wage was 15 silver for the year, exemption from the levy. The duty was maintenance and repair of all crown property within a day's ride. The contract did not define maintenance, it did not define repair, it did not specify materials, it did not set a limit on time spent per task. It did not distinguish between a loose hinge and a collapsed barn. These were the gaps, the tolerances. His mind, a tool sharpened by decades of silent observation, began to map the territory. The king saw a simple transaction, labor for coin. The fool saw a complex system of potential obligations. If he was to repair all crown property, then every cracked tile on a royal storehouse, every wobbly leg on a tax collector's chair, every dull blade on a forester's axe was now his responsibility. The contract gave him authority to demand materials. It did not say he had to use the most cost-effective materials. It did not say he could not use the materials he had salvaged, the bent nails, the scrap leather. His personal cost was not the labor he was accustomed to labor. His cost was the mental load of planning a campaign within these rules. He had to think like the system, but one step ahead. He had to anticipate what the crown would expect, cheap and quick fixes, and then deliver the opposite, thorough and expensive compliance. He would mend everything, he would use appropriate materials, he would document his work. He would become the most diligent servant the crown had ever employed. And in doing so, he would consume resources, time, and administrative energy at a rate the king had not budgeted for. The 15 silver wage was irrelevant. The real cost would be hidden in the requisitions, in the hours. In the sheer volume of work a truly diligent mender could generate when unleashed on a neglected estate. This was the new layer of implication. The conflict had moved inside the fool's mind. It was a war of logistics, of supply chains, of bureaucratic friction. The king had weaponized the law, the fool would weaponize duty. He would give the king exactly what he asked for, and in such abundance that it would become a burden. He signed the contract with a steady hand. He felt no excitement, only the cool focus of a craftsman who has finally been given a project worthy of his skill. The trap was no longer something he was setting. The trap was the contract itself, and he had just agreed to spring it from the inside. There is an old tale from the hills, told by shepherds on long nights. It speaks of a wolf that came to a valley, a wolf so large and fierce that it could kill a full-grown ram with one bite. The shepherds tried everything. They built higher fences, the wolf jumped them, they set traps, the wolf avoided them, they banded together with spears, the wolf vanished into the rocks. The wolf was not just strong, it was clever, it understood the shepherd's patterns. Then one shepherd, a young boy who was thought to be simple, did something different. He did not build a fence, he did not set a trap. He began to leave a single, small stone from the riverbed at the mouth of the wolf's den every morning, just one stone. The wolf would emerge, see the stone, and nudge it aside with its nose. It was an irritation, nothing more. The boy did this every day for a full turning of the moon, one stone, every morning. The wolf grew accustomed to the routine. The nudge became automatic. Then on the morning after the moon had turned, the boy did not bring a stone, he brought nothing. The wolf emerged from its den, it looked for the stone. There was no stone, it waited, it became agitated, it paced, it could not settle, the pattern was broken. The absence of the insignificant stone was more disruptive than the stone itself. The wolf spent the day searching, confused, its rhythm destroyed. It did not hunt, the sheep were safe. The boy had not fought the wolf, he had not outsmarted it in a contest of strength or cunning. He had used the wolf's own need for routine, its expectation of a minor, consistent event, as a weapon. He had weaponized predictability. The shepherds laughed at the boy at first, just as the village laughed at the fool. They saw a child playing with rocks. They did not see a strategist conducting a slow, cost-free siege on a predator's mind. The story does not end with the wolf's death. It ends with the wolf leaving the valley, not because it was defeated, but because its world had become uncomfortably unpredictable. The boy restored peace not by force, but by introducing a tiny, persistent asymmetry. The fool knew this story, he had heard it as a child. He understood its lesson. The powerful, whether wolf or king, rely on predictable systems. They expect resistance to be loud and direct. They do not expect the attack to come in the form of perfect compliance, of a single bad coin, of a request for materials to mend a chair leg with excessive thoroughness. The historical layer here is not about dates or kings, it is about the timeless pattern of asymmetric conflict. The weak cannot win in the arena chosen by the strong, they must change the arena. They must fight with stones when the enemy expects spears, with patience when the enemy expects frenzy, with legality when the enemy expects crime. The fool was not the first to do this. He was part of a long, quiet tradition of those who survived not by conquering, but by outlasting, by bending, by understanding the mechanics of the cage better than the jailer. His contract with the king was his river stone. He would place it day after day in the form of work orders and requisitions, until the absence of his normal, minimal compliance would feel like a crisis. The king was the wolf, waiting for the stone of rebellion. The fool would give him only the stone of duty, delivered with such weight and regularity that it would block the den. The king's reeve returned to the fool's cottage, this time with the signed contract and a list of initial tasks. The first was the royal storehouse at the crossroads, a stone building with a leaking roof and a door that sagged on its hinges. The reeve explained the procedure. The fool was to assess the needed repairs, submit a requisition for materials to the quartermaster at the garrison, and then perform the work. He would be given a chit, a small wooden token, to authorize the requisition. The system was now fully engaged. The fool took the chit, he walked to the storehouse, he did not just look at the roof and the door, he examined every inch, he noted a cracked foundation stone. He noted 3 loose floorboards, he noted a window shutter hanging by one hinge, he noted the iron latch, rusted and stiff. He spent half a day on this inspection, making small marks with a piece of chalk. Then he walked to the garrison. The quartermaster was a harried man surrounded by barrels and crates. The fool presented his chit and his list. The list was meticulous. It requested not just tiles for the roof, but the specific type of clay tile used in the original construction, which had to be ordered from a quarry 2 valleys over. It requested not just wood for the door, but seasoned oak of a certain thickness. It requested new iron hinges, pins, a latch assembly, mortar for the foundation, nails of 3 different sizes, linseed oil for the wood. and a small amount of lead for flashing. The quartermaster stared at the list. This was for a simple storehouse repair, he argued. He said plain tiles would do. He said common pine was sufficient. The fool listened, then he pointed to the contract which he had brought with him. It said maintenance and repair of all crown property. It did not say makeshift patchwork. To properly repair the storehouse to its original, functional state required these materials. To use inferior materials would be a disservice to the crown, and the repair would fail sooner, requiring more work. His tone was not argumentative. It was factual, calm. He was citing the logic of his trade. The quartermaster, bound by the system, had to either deny the request, which would be denying a royal contractor the means to do his job, or approve it. He approved it. He stamped the requisition with a sigh. The fool took the stamped paper. He did not smile. He had just won the first battle. He had established a precedent. He would repair things properly. Properly, according to the standards of his craft, was expensive. The systemic trap was now set. The king had created a binding contract. The fool was using it to bind the king's resources. Every requisition would be like this. Every task would be expanded to its fullest, most literal interpretation. The king had wanted to capture a source of cheap labor. Instead, he had activated a mechanism that would consume materials and administrative effort at a prodigious rate. The fool returned to the storehouse. He began with the foundation stone, mixing the mortar with careful, slow strokes. The work would take weeks, not days. And he would be paid his 15 silver for the year regardless. The conflict had entered its operational phase. The king was no longer an abstract authority. He was a line item in a quartermaster's ledger, and the fool had just written the first, very costly, entry. The storehouse repair became a lesson in systemic friction. The clay tiles had to be ordered. The order required a form in triplicate. The form had to be signed by the quartermaster, then by the garrison commander, then sent by rider to the quarry. The quarry had a backlog. The tiles would arrive in 6 weeks. The fool could not proceed with the roof, so he focused on the door. The seasoned oak was not in stock. It had to be sourced from the royal forest, which required a timber permit. The permit required the signature of the royal forester, who was away on a survey. The fool waited. He worked on what he could. He mixed mortar and repointed the foundation stone. He straightened the old hinges, cleaning them with vinegar and a wire brush until the iron shone. He used his own salvaged nails to secure the floorboards. He documented every step, every hour, on a wax tablet he kept for the purpose. When the forester returned and signed the permit, the oak was felled. It had to be milled. The mill had its own schedule. 2 more weeks passed. The fool did not idle. He submitted a new requisition for the next item on his list, the royal granary at the edge of the village, which had a cracked lintel over its main door. He began the same process: inspection, meticulous list, requisition. The quartermaster, seeing the growing pile of pending requests, began to panic. His budget was not designed for this. His storage sheds were filling with specialized materials for projects that were stalled, waiting on other parts of the system. The fool became a constant, quiet presence at the garrison gate, his wax tablet in hand, his requests precise and unanswerable. He was not demanding. He was simply following the procedure the crown had established. The contract was the engine, the requisition system was the transmission. The fool was applying maximum load in first gear. The systemic cost was now visible. It was not just the cost of the tiles or the oak. It was the cost of the rider's time, the forester's time, the miller's time, the quartermaster's administrative labor. It was the cost of storage space occupied by dormant materials. It was the cost of delayed projects. The king's efficient machine was gumming up with the grease of its own bureaucracy, applied by a man who knew exactly which cog to push. The fool's personal layer here was one of immense patience. He woke each day, walked to his current site, and worked on whatever component was available. If nothing was available, he would perform maintenance on his own tools, or continue his salvage work, adding to his private stockpile. He felt no frustration at the delays. The delays were part of the plan. They increased the cost. They demonstrated the system's inability to handle true, thorough compliance. The village watched, their mockery now tinged with confusion. They saw the fool working slowly, methodically, while royal carts came and went with materials. They did not understand the economic battle being waged. They saw only that the fool had become a peculiar kind of royal servant, one who seemed to cause more paperwork than progress. The trap was no longer a concept. It was a physical reality, a stack of forms on the quartermaster's desk, a shed full of expensive tiles, and a storehouse that was only 1/10 repaired after a month of effort. The king had wanted to harness the fool's labor. Instead, he had harnessed his own bureaucracy to the fool's deliberate, plodding pace. The quartermaster's reports to the treasurer grew increasingly frantic. Budget lines for local infrastructure were being exhausted not by completed projects, but by pending requisitions and specialized material purchases. The storehouse was a money pit. The granary lintel required a stone mason's consultation, another cost. The fool had identified a dozen minor issues with the garrison's own equipment, from wobbly cartwheels to a leaky forge bellows, and had submitted requisitions for those as well. The societal consequence began to ripple outward. The royal forester, overwhelmed with timber permits for the fool's projects, had less time to manage the forest, leading to minor pilfering. The mill, busy with royal oak, delayed orders for village lumber, causing local tensions. The garrison's supplies, meant for soldiers and routine upkeep, were being diverted to a single, slow-moving repair operation. The village, which had been squeezed by the tax, now watched as royal resources flowed in, but not to them. They saw the fool at the center of it, a silent vortex drawing wealth and attention. Their mockery curdled into something darker, a confused resentment. They could not articulate what was happening, but they felt the imbalance. The blacksmith, who had paid his tax in full, saw the fool receiving new iron hinges while his own orders for common nails were delayed. The weaver, nursing her penalty, saw fine oak being unloaded for a door, while her own loom needed a simple repair she could not afford. The system was being turned inside out. The king's mechanism for extracting wealth was now being used to redistribute it, chaotically and inefficiently, back to the periphery, but only through the narrow channel of the fool's contract. The societal layer here was one of distorted priorities. The village's economy, already stressed, was now further warped by the needs of the fool's meticulous campaign. He had become a black hole of bureaucratic gravity, bending the local expression of royal power around himself. The quartermaster, in desperation, tried to limit the fool. He said future requisitions required pre-approval from the treasurer. The fool nodded. He prepared a packet. It contained his detailed inspection reports for the next 5 sites, his material lists, and a copy of the contract highlighting the clause about maintenance of all crown property. He sent it with the next royal courier. The delay added another month to the process. During that month, he worked on the storehouse door with the salvaged materials he had, making it perfect. When the approval finally came, stamped and signed by a weary treasurer who just wanted the problem to go away, it was a blanket authorization for necessary materials. The fool had won again. The system, designed to control, had been forced to grant autonomy to the very thing it could not control. The consequences were now undeniable. The local budget was broken, projects were stalled, materials were stockpiled, administrative morale was low. And the fool, the cause of it all, continued his work, his hands steady, his face calm, a portrait of diligent service. The king's trap had sprung, but it had caught the king's own foot. The societal fabric, meant to be taut under the crown's control, was now sagging under the weight of a single man's literal interpretation of duty. The final report landed on the king's desk with a thud. It was not from the treasurer. It was from the quartermaster, a direct, unprecedented breach of protocol driven by despair. It detailed the financial hemorrhage. The storehouse repair had cost 5 times its estimated value and was only half done. The granary project was stalled awaiting stone. The garrison's operational funds were depleted. The local budget for the year was exhausted, and it was only the 7th month. The king raided once, then he raided again. His face, usually a mask of calm authority, began to flush. He could see the numbers, but he could not see the enemy. There was no rebellion. There was no embezzlement. There was only work orders, material lists, and a contract he himself had authorized. The fool's name appeared throughout, not as a villain, but as the requesting agent. The king's rage was cold, silent, and terrifying. It was the rage of a man who has been out-maneuvered by a tool he thought was a toy. He summoned the treasurer. He did not shout. His voice was a low, controlled scrape. He demanded an explanation. The treasurer stammered about the contract, about the man's literal interpretation, about the systemic delays. The king cut him off. "Bring him here," the king said. "Bring the fool to me." The order was given, riders were dispatched. The king spent the next days in a simmering fury. He reviewed the contract himself, line by line. He saw no flaw. It was airtight. That was the problem. It was too perfect. It gave the mender exactly what he needed to do his job, and he was doing it with a thoroughness that was financially ruinous. The king's psychology here was one of catastrophic cognitive dissonance. His world view that systems control people was colliding with the reality that a person could control a system from within. He felt helpless. He could not arrest the fool for doing his job. He could not void the contract without appearing capricious and undermining the rule of law he relied upon. He could only watch as the mechanism he built drained his coffers. The sound of his own grinding teeth was the soundtrack of his defeat. When the fool was brought into the throne room, he did not kneel with elaborate ceremony. He stood quiet, his hands at his sides, his clothes smelling faintly of wood smoke and pine resin. He looked at the king, not with defiance, but with the same calm attention he gave to a broken hinge. The king stared at this man, this silent, unassuming creature who had cost him so much. He saw no genius, no trickster. He saw only the face of the village fool, and in that moment the king understood the depth of his error. He had not underestimated a man. He had underestimated the power of meticulous, literal action within the rules. The fool had not broken the system. He had followed it to a conclusion the king never imagined. The king's voice, when it finally came, was hollow. "Why?" he asked. The fool looked at him for a long moment. Then he spoke, his voice rough from disuse but clear. "You asked for 15%, he said. "I gave you 15%. You asked for maintenance. I am maintaining." The words were simple. They were the truth. They were the trap sprung. The king had no answer. The collapse was not external, it was internal. The king's arrogance, his greed for cheap labor, his belief in his own superior intellect, had engineered his own financial and psychological defeat. The fool had not raised a hand against him. He had simply accepted every gift the king offered, the tax, the contract, the authority, and had used them exactly as given. The villain had destroyed himself through his own greed for control. The king dismissed the fool. He did not have him imprisoned. He did not have him punished. There was no crime. The justice was systemic, and it was already complete. The king issued a new decree. The infrastructure levy was suspended for the remainder of the year in the village and its surrounding district. The royal contract with the mender was terminated, with the fool receiving his full year's wage of 15 silver for the work already done. The quartermaster was ordered to liquidate the stockpiled materials, selling them at a loss to recoup some funds. The storehouse would remain half-repaired, a permanent monument to the cost of arrogance. The system had been forced to correct itself. The rules, pressed to their logical extreme by the fool, had revealed their own unsustainable cost. The king had no choice but to retreat. To continue would be to bankrupt the local administration for no visible gain. The fool returned to his village. He carried his wage, a small pouch of silver. He did not spend it on celebration. He used it to buy a few tools he had long needed and to replenish his stores of wax and oil. He returned to his workshop. The air still smelled of pine and metal. His tools were where he had left them. He picked up a half-finished project, a small box with a tricky lock mechanism. He began to work, his hands moving with the same deliberate care. The village watched him return. They had heard rumors of the king's rage, of the suspended tax. They did not understand the connection, not fully. But they felt the change. The pressure of the levy was gone. The frantic energy of the garrison had subsided. The fool was back, mending his small things. The difference was in their gaze. The mockery was gone. It was replaced by a wary, confused respect. They did not call him a fool to his face anymore. They did not call him anything. They simply watched and wondered. The societal justice was not a revolution. It was a recalibration. The king's power had been checked, not by force, but by the demonstration of its own limits. The village had learned, through the fool's actions, that the system could be engaged, that its demands were not absolute. They had seen that silence could be a weapon, that compliance could be a form of siege. The fool had not sought to lead them. He had not given a speech. He had simply acted according to his own code, within the rules they all shared, and in doing so he had changed the rules. Peace was restored, but it was a different peace. It was a peace born of wisdom, the hard-earned wisdom that the powerful are often most vulnerable to the one who does exactly what they ask, who takes them at their word, and who has the patience to see the task through to its ruinous, logical end. The village returned to its rhythms. The tax was gone. The king's attention turned elsewhere. In the fool's workshop, the small box with the tricky lock clicked shut, the mechanism smooth and silent. He placed it on a shelf beside other mended things. Outside, the first frost touched the ground, making the gravel path crunch underfoot. The blacksmith repaired his own tools now, taking more care. The weaver saved her coins, having learned the cost of a shortfall. The farmer looked at his field with different eyes, calculating not just yield, but margin. No one spoke of what had happened. It entered the village memory not as a story, but as a shift in the air, a slight change in how they walked, how they counted, how they read the words on a posted decree. The fool walked to the well at his usual time. The conversations did not dip as he passed. They continued, but the tone was quieter, more measured. He nodded, the same neutral dip of the chin. He drew his water. The bucket came up full, the rope rough in his hands. He carried it back along the edge of the path. The sound of his footsteps was the same. The scent of cold earth and wood smoke was the same. The historical record would show a tax suspended for administrative reasons. The royal ledgers would show a loss on local infrastructure. The village had no written record. It had a man mending a chair in the grey light of a winter afternoon, his hands moving with a certainty that needed no witness. The road to the king's city lay empty under the pale sky. In the garrison, the quartermaster filed the final reports, the paper rustling like dry leaves. The storehouse stood with its new door and its old roof, a question no one asked aloud. The evidence was all there, in the balance sheets, in the finished projects in the quiet of a village that had learned without being taught. That the most powerful weapon is often the one the system gives you, and the most dangerous person is the one who takes it literally.